classification. So classification is where you just basically put things into groups. We do it every day. So sometimes classification could be where we classify our clothing. We put shoes in certain groups. We put pants in certain groups. Classification is just really just making groups for different things. Scientifically, we talk about classification in terms of taxonomy. So taxonomy is the identification and classification of organisms based on shared characteristics. Now, taxonomy started back in the mid 1700s by Carolus Linnaeus, and he's credited with creating a system in which he organized species into a hierarchy from largest to smallest. So he started off with some larger groups, and in those larger groups were smaller groups. He also developed a two-word naming system that we still use today. And this two-word naming system is called binomial nomenclature. We'll be taking a look at how we write certain genus names and species names by using binomial nomenclature. So let's take a look at how we use binomial nomenclature. Now every living thing in the world has a name. Sometimes we call things flowers, or we call things certain types of flowers. Same goes for what's pictured here, a crab. Locally, we have certain names for things. However, in other countries or other people don't necessarily call the same creature by the same name that we do. So this two-part scientific name is based off of the genus and the species of the organism. So the first part is the genus. The second part is the species. So taking a look here, which is a blue crab, Calanectis sapidus. Calanectis is our genus, and sapidus is our species. Now there's a certain way to write it as well. So you notice here we have two different ways. So if we were handwriting something, I would have to underline it. So if we were writing it in a notebook or in our notes right now, we would have to actually underline. However, if I was typing it like I have here, notice I do have things circled, but I have things in italics here. And I have things circled here because it's very important that you take a look at these, is that the first letter in the genus is always capitalized. In species name, it's always lowercase. So handwriting we underline, but when we type it out, we're going to use italics. And always remember that the genus is always capitalized, the species name is always lowercase. Now we also have taxonomic categories, and this is just an order, basically, of how we can organize and classify things. Now, on the left are the actual taxonomic categories, and these are domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now we go from the very top, which is domain. This is our largest category. We have very few domains, but we have tons and tons and tons of organisms in those three domains. As we move down the list, we actually get more and more of these with fewer and fewer organisms in them. So for example, we have 3 domains, yet we have millions and millions of species of organisms on Earth. So when we look at domains, we have millions of organisms. But once we get down to a species level, there's only one. So in a grouping, there's only one type of group. So if we're talking, let's say, about dogs, dogs will fit into a domain called Euchara. We'll take a look at that soon. Yet the dog species is Domesticus. The genus is Canis. So the Canis domesticus is your typical dog that we have. And it's very, very specific once we get down here. There's millions of organisms in the same domain as a dog. Now, how do we remember this? Well, I have on the right what you can use as a mnemonic. Now, you might have your own mnemonic, but this is what I've learned when I was very young. So, did King Philip call out for green spinach? So, this is my mnemonic, but you might have one of your own. So, feel free to jot that down in your notes. So, here we just have an example of a blue crab. If you see here that we have several different listings for our taxonomic categories. So starting off with kingdom, I would have domain here, but this is a eukaryote, so it would be in domain Eucara. So we have kingdom Animalia. Our next smaller group is a phylum, Arthropoda, basically means that these are arthropods. Now sometimes you might see subphylums as well. Um, However, not everything has a subphylum or a subclass or something like that. But here we have a subphylum called Crustacea. You've probably heard of crustaceans before. And then we're getting even smaller. So we have the class Malacostraca, the order Decapoda, family Fortunidae, genus Calanectes, and the species is Sapidus. So we go from a lot of organisms in this kingdom of Animalia down to very few. So it goes from largest to smallest. Another example for you is the camel. So I know in your notes, jot this down as well. So as another example, we have the camel as kingdom in Animalia once again. Phylum is Chordata. So a chordate is something that has a spinal cord, something that has a nerve cord. The class is Mammalia. This is the same class that we are in. Order, family, genus, and species. So remember, we go from the very largest, where the most animals are, the most organisms are in this kingdom Animalia, and as we go down, we're going to have fewer and fewer organisms in those particular categories. However, the number of phylums, classes, orders, families, genus, species, these will rise. So each level of classification is based on characteristics that are shared by all the organisms it contains. So think of this as a Russian nesting doll. So those are the dolls that fit inside of each other. So you have a really large doll and then another smaller one and then a smaller one, smaller one, smaller one until you have this tiny little Russian nesting doll. It's really, really tiny. So that's kind of what these are. Think of the domain as having the most number of organisms in it. However, there's very few domains. We only have 3. So a domain contains kingdoms, and then within those kingdoms contain phyla. The phylums, the phyla, contain classes. The class contains orders. An order contains families. A family contains genera or multiple genuses, and a genus contains a species. Until you have this one lonely organism down here. So many organisms start at the top down to 1. It's very important that you understand that, only because the whole system is based off of the number of organisms that are contained in it. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to this type of classification, to taxonomy. Now, there are some very good advantages, including that it's a common way of communicating, regardless of native language, as I mentioned before. It's also an easy way to understand and remember all these organisms. Now, there's definitely disadvantages to taxonomy as well. So sometimes, even though we have shared characteristics, sometimes those shared characteristics really aren't, they're not related to each other according to DNA evidence. So every time we have new DNA or fossil evidence, they're possibly going to change some of those current classifications. And that does happen on a daily basis, and scientists are constantly changing those. Plus, there's new species, there's new genera, there's new phyla that are discovered every day. we only have touched the surface of the organisms that we currently have on the planet in terms of discovery. So every day we're discovering new ones that can change the way that the things are classified. So there's just definitely advantages and disadvantages to this classic sense of taxonomy as we know it. So there's definitely been changes made since Linnaeus made his classification scheme back in the mid 1700s. So originally he only had two kingdoms, but he didn't have any domains, which is the largest grouping. By the 1800s, the study of evolution and Charles Darwin and all of his studies of the origin of species added new dimension to the system. So, with all of this new knowledge, the result now was three new kingdoms. So, we actually had five total at this point. Now, fun tidbit, when I was in school, I learned those five kingdoms. Now, you are learning what we have today, which is six kingdoms. So, these six kingdoms are all based upon genetics and biochemistry and a lot of new knowledge that came about since the 1800s and since my time as well, when I studied it back in middle school. So, what's the goal of evolutionary classification? So, we just mentioned taxonomy, and taxonomy is the study of shared characteristics. So, now that we have DNA and we understand evolution a little bit more, now we're able to kind of change things up a little bit. And so, we have a study called phylogeny, and phylogeny is the evolutionary history of lineages. So these are based upon evolutionary descent and DNA rather than shared characteristics. So if you kind of think about wings on certain things, wings evolutionarily have developed in certain species, sometimes independently of each other. Let's say birds versus insects. They both have wings, but evolutionarily, they really aren't descendants upon each other. So phylogeny helps categorize them by evolutionary history. And cladistics is the way that scientists do this. So this is a method of analysis that reconstructs evolutionary histories or phylogenies by inferring those relationships based upon shared characteristics as we did in taxonomy. However, it also bases it more on that evolutionary history. So biologists create something called clades, and these are groups of species that include a single common ancestor and all descendants of that ancestor. So a clade, or even a cladogram, so depending upon how we're talking about it, these cladograms show how closely two or more groups are related based on important characteristics. So if we take a look at this picture here, it kind of looks like a family tree, how we would do our family histories. However, if we look down way down here at the bottom left, we kind of have where my mouse is right now. This would be our common ancestor for all of these organisms. Now, you're probably wondering, what do we have to do with a lamprey, or how are we related to a shark? So remember, evolutionarily, we have this way back in the day, we have this common ancestor. And if we come up here along this track, where we have all of these characteristics, and these are called derived characters. So we're going to take a look at all these derived characters that have developed in one group, but not another group. And so that's where we can kind of say, ooh, there's a common ancestor here that has developed this derived character that now allows us and all of those following species to have that character. So back on this line, way back down here at the left, common ancestor way down here. We don't know what it is right now because it's not on our clade. But as we move up it, we have lampreys, and they don't have jaws. But somewhere along the line, if you see this, jaws were they kind of came about in the origin of species. So lampreys don't have jaws, but that common ancestor for jaws has spawned all of these following organisms because now everything up here has jaws. So if we continue up here further along, We have the shark. Well, the shark kind of came off our little big family tree here because lungs were developed. So the common ancestor for everything above here has lungs. But the shark doesn't have lungs, so they're not a part of that particular clade. So that's kind of how the cladogram works, by derived characteristics. And we'll be following up with this a lot in class. So this way you can kind of read a cladogram and understand what it really means. So let's take a look at the role of DNA in classification. So as with evolutionary classification, DNA plays a humongous role. And that role helps helps scientists to determine what that derived character looks like and how closely two species or two organisms are together. So if we were to take a look at this picture here, or these three pictures, notice that they are all birds, and they definitely look alike. We don't really think too much about birds and what they look like, but all birds pretty much have similar DNA. So if we were to look at this according to classification, just traditional classification, we probably would put these into two main groups. I'd say that we would put the stork over here into one group, and we'd put these vultures into a second group. However, we have over here that the American vulture, I should say, the top picture right here, this American vulture, is actually more closely related to the stork over here on the left than it is to the African vulture over on the right. So even though the American vulture and the African vulture look a lot more similar to each other, DNA says that our American vultures are actually more closely related to these storks. So that's how DNA has kind of changed classification recently, since DNA came about and we're able to use this now. So DNA itself has changed the way that we actually put things into categories.